In November 1918, a man stood on a railway platform in a country that wasn't his, waiting for a border guard to decide whether he'd be let in. 2 days earlier, he had ruled Germany. That month, 22 royal houses fell. Not one was ever restored. And yet, more than a century later, the German state sat down with that man's great-great-grandson to sign an agreement over 27,000 objects. The empire ended in 1918. The argument didn't. Germany in 1914 wasn't a country with a royal family. It was a country with 22 of them. The German Empire was a federation of monarchies, 4 kingdoms, 6 grand duchies, 5 duchies, 7 principalities, each with its own court, palaces and private fortune. Above them all sat the King of Prussia, wearing a second crown as German Emperor. In November 1918, all of it ended in under a week. The fleet mutinied at Kiel rather than sail on a suicide mission. Within days, workers' and soldiers' councils held the port cities. Then Berlin. On the 9th of November, the Chancellor did something no Chancellor had the authority to do. He announced the Kaiser's abdication, without asking the Kaiser. By the time Wilhelm was told, it was already in print. 22 thrones, 1 month, and 22 families who suddenly had to work out what they were now. Wilhelm II was at army headquarters in Spa, in occupied Belgium. He raged. He offered to give up the imperial crown but stay King of Prussia, a distinction that had stopped meaning anything to anyone but him. His quartermaster general told him the army no longer stood behind him. At dawn the next morning, he was in a motorcade heading for the Dutch border. He reached the border station at Eijsden and waited. On the platform, Belgian refugees and locals recognized him and shouted at him. He had commanded millions of men. He was now a man in a coat, hoping a neutral government would take him in. They did. Versailles would demand his extradition for trial. The Dutch refused, and the Allies let it drop. On the 28th of November, in a borrowed castle, he signed the paper that made the abdication his own act instead of his chancellor's. 500 years of Hohenzollern rule in Brandenburg signed away on somebody else's desk. And then something happened that nobody expected. In 1920, he bought a country house in the Dutch village of Doorn. Then the wagons started arriving, 59 railway wagons of furniture, paintings, silver and books, the portable contents of the Hohenzollern palaces, shipped across an international border with the German government's cooperation. Deposed monarchs are usually broke. The Romanovs were murdered and stripped. Wilhelm II spent 23 years of exile in a house with a private chapel, a park, and roughly 60 staff. Because the revolution took the crowns and didn't take the estates. Here's why. For 400 years, the Hohenzollern family and the Prussian state had effectively been the same institution. Land bought by a king in 1740, was that the king's or the kingdom's? Nobody had ever needed to answer. In 1918 it became a legal question, and the courts that answered it were the imperial courts. The same judges, the same oaths. When deposed princes sued the new republic, they tended to win. By 1925, Prussia had drafted a settlement so generous to the Hohenzollerns that when the terms leaked, the country detonated. The communists launched a petition to expropriate the former ruling houses outright. The Social Democrats joined, then voters from the Catholic Centre and the Liberals. A referendum was set for June 1926. 14.5 million Germans voted to strip the princes. Fewer than 600,000 voted against. It failed. President Hindenburg, an imperial field marshal, had it classified as a constitutional matter, which meant it needed a majority of every eligible voter, not of votes cast. Turnout was 39%, the bar was 50%. What followed was a negotiated split. Prussia kept around 75 properties. The family got back around 39, including a Tudor-styled mansion in Potsdam called Sicilienhof. Remember that name. So a family that had lost a throne, a war, and an empire came out of the revolution as one of Germany's largest private landowners. The Crown Prince, the Kaiser's eldest son, a Verdun commander, had been allowed home in 1923 on condition he stay out of politics. He moved into Sicilienhof and did not stay out of politics. To millions of Germans, the Republic felt temporary. For the officer corps and the aristocracy, the monarchy wasn't history, it was a government in waiting. He spent years trying to fuse the fractured German right into one bloc, a bloc that would need a symbol at the top. He appears to have believed it would be him. In 1932, before the presidential runoff, he publicly declared his support for Adolf Hitler and called on others to vote the same way. That wasn't worth votes, it was worth permission. The last Crown Prince of Germany telling the aristocracy and the officer corps that Hitler was an acceptable German. His brother went further. Prince August Wilhelm, the Kaiser's fourth son, joined the Nazi Party in 1930, put on the brown shirt of the SA, and toured the country speaking before Hitler. In March 1933, at the Garrison Church in Potsdam, the regime staged a ceremony marrying itself to the Prussian past. Hindenburg in imperial uniform, Hitler bowing. The Crown Prince in the front row, in hussar uniform. The old elites thought they were the adults in the room. Give the movement the chancellorship, surround it with conservatives, then take the state back, with a king on top. Hitler never once committed to restoring the monarchy. When Hindenburg died in 1934, the presidency didn't go to a Hohenzollern, it went to him. But not every German royal family made that bet, and the difference matters. In Bavaria, Crown Prince Ruprecht of the House of Wittelsbach refused every approach. He had opposed Hitler's 1923 putsch and said openly what he thought of him. In 1939, he left for Italy. In October 1944, the Gestapo arrested his wife and children. They were sent to Sachsenhausen, then Dachau, and liberated there in April 1945. Bavaria had already settled with its royal family in 1923. Palaces and art folded into a public fund, the family waiving future claims. One state solved the property question in 3 years. Prussia's took 100. Same collapse, different choices, very different consequences. The answer to whether the Hohenzollerns used Hitler or Hitler used them arrives in a Potsdam churchyard in May 1940. Prince Wilhelm, the Crown Prince's eldest son, had given up his place in the succession to marry a commoner. He enlisted anyway, went into France, and died of his wounds in a field hospital. More than 50,000 people came to his funeral, 50,000 Germans, in the middle of a triumphant war, standing in a park for a dead prince with no claim to anything. By most accounts, the largest unofficial public gathering in Germany, under Nazi rule. Hitler understood exactly what he was looking at, a rival loyalty. Within weeks came the prince's decree, members of the formerly reigning houses removed from frontline service, and in 1943 from the officer corps altogether. They had helped make him respectable. His answer was to take away their uniforms. Then it stopped being political. In 1945, the Red Army reached Brandenburg, and Sicilienhof was seized. That July, Stalin, Truman and Churchill sat in its garden rooms and decided the future of Germany. The Potsdam Conference took place in the Hohenzollerns' living room. Soviet land reform expropriated the eastern estates without compensation, and almost everything the family had kept in 1926 lay in the east. In 1947, the Allies abolished the state of Prussia itself, which should be the end of the story. The last emperor died at dawn in 1941, having left instructions that he was not to return to Germany unless the monarchy was restored. It wasn't. The man who inherited the wreckage was the one who'd kept his distance from it. Louis Ferdinand, a grandson who had once worked on a Ford assembly line in Detroit, headed the family for 43 years and turned it from a claimant into an institution. Then in 1989 the wall came down, and everything lost in 1945 was on the other side of a border that no longer existed. In 1994, reunified Germany passed a law compensating owners of property seized in the Soviet zone, with one condition: no compensation for anyone whose ancestor had given substantial support to the Nazi system. Substantial support. 2 words, applied to a family whose most prominent 20th century member had worn a hussar uniform in Potsdam in 1933. Louis Ferdinand died that same year. His own heir had died years earlier, so the head of the House of Hohenzollern became his grandson, Georg Friedrich, 18 years old, still at school. In 2014, with lawyers, he opened negotiations with the German state. Thousands of artworks, compensation for expropriated property, and a right of residence in a palace, Sicilienhof. The talks leaked in 2019, and because everything turned on those two words, the case became a historian's war. Both sides commissioned expert reports on one question: did the Crown Prince give substantial support to the Nazis? The reports contradicted each other. Two concluded he had, lending the Nazis legitimacy at the decisive moment. A third judged him politically marginal, then publicly revised his position. A fourth argued the opposite, that he mattered enormously and was maneuvering against Hitler. 4 historians, 4 readings of the same man. Then the family's lawyers moved against historians and journalists, and Germany's Association of Historians publicly objected. A dynasty was litigating the interpretation of its own past. The negotiations collapsed in 2022 and went to court. Then, in 2023, Georg Friedrich withdrew everything: the artworks, the compensation, the lawsuits. He said he hoped it would open the way to an unencumbered debate about his family's role. And on the 12th of May 2025, at Sanssouci, the federal government, Berlin, Brandenburg, and the head of the House of Hohenzollern announced it was over. Around 27,000 disputed objects went into a new non-profit foundation, 6 council seats for the public side, 3 for the family. Everything stays in the museums where it already hangs. The family kept a short list of personal items, among them 7 tobacco boxes. A dispute that began in 1926 over palaces ended in 2025 over snuff boxes. On the 9th of February 2026, that foundation's council met for the first time, chairing it, an official of the German federal government. Sitting as deputy chairman, the great-great-grandson of Kaiser Wilhelm II. 6 weeks earlier, he had become sole owner of Hohenzollern Castle, the ancestral seat, now a tourist attraction with a ticket office. That's the answer. They weren't executed. They weren't exiled forever. They weren't erased. They were absorbed. What they lost in 1918 was sovereignty. What they kept was almost everything else. And the second thing turned out to be much harder to take away, and much harder to be forgiven for. A family that had been the state spent a century working out what it was once the state no longer needed it. It tried exile, it tried restoration, it tried an alliance with something it couldn't control, and that alliance cost it everything the revolution had left behind. The objects stay public, the history stays open, and the descendant sits on the board, not a throne, a seat at the table. The last German emperor spent 23 years in a Dutch garden, chopping down trees and counting them, waiting for a country to ask him back. It never did. But it never quite finished with him either. If you want more stories about the decisions that changed history, subscribe.